President Trump gives a speech in Pennsylvania telling voters that prices are now going down, while suggesting again that the affordability issue is a hoax. But is the public likely to take his word for it? And what could Republicans really do if they decide the prices in the economy are a real political threat?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's opinion pages, Alicia Finley and Matt Continetti. The signs at President Trump's rally on Tuesday in Mount Pocono, Pennsylvania, read lower prices, bigger paychecks, suggesting that the White House is hearing the political concern for Republicans about the country's economic anxiety. But the thrust of Trump's message on Tuesday seemed to be, what economic anxiety? You guys are doing great. Listen to this.
You're getting lower prices, bigger paychecks. We're getting inflation. We're crushing it. And you're getting much higher wages. I mean, the only thing that's really going up big, it's called the stock market and your 401ks. It's going up. But I say it, and I said it the other day, and a lot of people misinterpret it. They say, oh, he doesn't realize prices are high. Prices are coming down very substantially. But they have a new word. They always have a hoax. The new word is affordability. So they look at the camera and they say, this election is all about affordability.
Alicia, what's the reality? I mean, to set the level, I think it's true that voters largely blamed Biden for the inflation problem that took place under his watch, hitting 9% year over year. Trump has done some things to help, including on energy, to take one example. But the September inflation reading still said 3% year over year, which, as Trump might say, not good.
That's right, 3% year over year. And the reality is the Federal Reserve's longtime goal, has been 2%. To add insult to injury, many workers didn't even get a 3% raise. It really depended on the sector by sector. And if you go into the CPI breakdown on the particular categories, you found like particular services, electricity, gas prices, not gasoline prices, but natural gas, like for heating and that, those increased by significantly more, around 5% for electricity, around 11% for natural gas. Rents are increasing about 3.2%. Used car prices about 5% year over. So many of the things that people spend a lot of money on are continuing to increase at a much more rapid clip than they were the pre-pandemic. And if you actually look at his first term, inflation averaged out around 2%, and you actually saw real wage growth. And so the issue I think that people are experiencing is that their wages didn't keep up with the inflation under Joe Biden for the most part. Maybe for some select workers, they did, but for most of them didn't. And now they're still kind of being, they're stagnant. They're still seeing prices increase. Their wages don't feel like they're catching up at the same rate. They're having to work longer to get paid, basically, or just to stay still.
Matt, I wonder how much President Trump is at risk of repeating a mistake made by his predecessor, which is telling voters how they should feel about the economy instead of listening to voters when they explain how they feel about the economy. There was many statements from the White House advisors under President Biden suggesting this is a good economy. You guys don't know how good you have it. And it's kind of a who do you trust, me or your lying pocketbooks effect. On the same point, there was another riff by President Trump at this rally in Pennsylvania, a statement he has made before about whether we really need all of this stuff that we get from overseas.
You can give up certain products. You can give up pencils. Because under the China policy, every child can get 37 pencils. They only need one or two. They don't need that many. But you always need steel. You don't need $37 for your daughter. 2 or 3 is nice, but you don't need $37.
One of our colleagues, Sierra McLean, had an op-ed in the Journal this week talking to toy manufacturers and retailers and explaining how they have been forced to raise their prices sometimes between 8% and 15%. Another one said 15% to 20%. And Matt, I don't think voters are going to take it very well if the response by President Trump is, your kids don't need all that junk anyway. It's a little grinchy.
It's the line he's used before, and it was roundly criticized for it, and it kind of went into hibernation before it resurfaced at yesterday's rally as part of Trump's infamous weave, when he goes from subject to subject in a kind of stand-up comic patter. And you could tell, Kyle, when we listened to the clip, that the audience reaction was kind of laughing at his sarcasm. But if you're a toy manufacturer, or if you are a parent buying gifts for the holidays, you probably won't be laughing if toys or pencils are more expensive than you would like. Look, I think the most important thing about the rally was that it was held at all. President Trump has not done much political travel this year. He had a major rally to mark his 100 days in office earlier this last spring. But since then, he has really been confined to the White House or to Mar-a-Lago, to Bedminster. Overseas travel, not much travel in the United States, especially discussing the issues with audiences who are favorable to him, kind of voters, as opposed to, say, business groups or select VIPs. So it's important. And what it means is that the White House understands that this is a huge vulnerability for President Trump ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. The economy is the number one issue. It has gone from being Trump's strongest issue to being his weakest issue. And so the very fact that he's out there talking about it, yes, always incorporating the weave, but there were some lines that came out that shows that the president and his team knows they need to correct for the economic situation if they have any hope of retaining the House next year.
But if they recognize this as a political vulnerability, Alicia, and if they come to the conclusion eventually that telling voters the economy is great and prices are going down is not convincing the electorate, what are the real policy levers that the president has, things that he could do to actually tackle this affordability issue?
Right. So, in my view, I share Milton Friedman's view that inflation is everywhere. A monetary, effective monetary policy. So you really need to, number one, most important thing is really to appoint someone as the Fed chair who believes in, sound money, and it doesn't decide to cut interest rates or start quantitative easing willy-nilly. Because I think, in my view, that would fuel inflation. But there are a lot of things that are under the president's executive powers that he could do to boost the supply side of the economy that would increase productivity, lift wages and lower prices. And I would throw out, permitting reform. Some of that would really require an act of Congress, but there are some things that the president could do to speed up projects, especially for power plants. One of the big reasons electricity prices have been increasing is shortages of power. And so to the extent that you can expedite the construction of new power plants and pipelines, because one of the reasons why you can't build power or struggles to build new power plants in places is because they can't get gas to build new pipelines. And then there are other reasons, shortage of gas turbines, of course. But there are things that he could do to, expedite permitting that would, increase production of some things to boost the supply. There are labor shortages. Yes, we keep on hearing about layoffs and all that, but there are major labor shortages in certain sectors of the economy, trucking, construction, in particular. And you see this in the JOLTS reports, the Bureau of Labor Statistics JOLTS report, as well as the National Federation of Independent Businesses, for small businesses, saying, they can't find workers. And one reason is because of President Trump's, workplace raids that have caused a lot of immigrants, both legal and illegal, not to show up for work because they're afraid of getting rounded up and deported. Not that just that they have actually deported some of these workers. President Trump said he was only going after the criminals, but in practice, the ICE actually has deported some people who are law-abiding workers. So stopping that would help. Also expanding, or providing more H-2B visas, and these are for kind of seasonal non-agriculture businesses. You think of like the Gulf Coast fisheries, Alaska, the salmon fisheries, as well as a lot of landscapers. Strange as that may sound, landscapers really depend on this program. There are others, but a lot of them, they're begging the administration to use his discretionary authority to release more of these visas, because otherwise they may not be able to operate, and then the native-born Americans could lose jobs. So there's just a few, but there are many other examples of the things that the administration could do that would at least help, boost the economy, make people feel a little bit better. And yes, the effects or the benefits may take some time. They won't be immediate, but at least he'll be showing that he's doing something other than just, adding on tariffs.
I would second the idea of a permitting reform if you were easing the ability of builders, developers to get projects going. You'd get more investment. On the other hand, that might be a heavier political lift, because I think getting that through Congress would require 60 votes in the Senate. You can probably not do that without overcoming a Senate filibuster, though maybe there are some Democrats who are frustrated enough at the permitting headaches that have been caused on green power projects, transmission lines, and so forth, that maybe there's some possibility for a deal. But Matt, we also have more budget reconciliation opportunities that Congress could take advantage of. So maybe there's some possibility, if Congress got together and if President Trump made it a priority, of some kind of additional pro-growth tax reform package. I know Trump is out there talking about no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, the things that were part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. But if there's a chance to do something else on the corporate side or on capital gains, I think that would help the economy.
It absolutely would. I think that the White House feels that they don't want to be in a position where Democrats can attack them for giveaways to the rich. But the truth is, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act included a lot of tax policy favorable to the working class. So if you get attacked for being too solicitous of the rich, the administration can say, well, look at the no tax on tips. Look at the withholding changes. Look at the no tax on the car interest loans. Those are all policies we use to appeal to the working class. They're going to kick in the beginning of next year and probably help consumers and taxpayers early on. Now's the time maybe to look at some changes on the corporate side. And the one tax that always has payoffs is capital gains tax reform. So indexing the capital gains taxes to inflation would be, I think, a huge boost to the economy. There's another policy too, Kyle, that the president should reexamine. That's his tariff policy. He's already been introducing these exceptions for coffee, for bananas, understanding that unlike a lot of the public rhetoric, these tariffs do raise prices for consumers. So if you can give the exemptions for coffee and bananas in order to lower prices at the grocery store or at the coffee shop, maybe you can lower some of the prices on these inputs to our manufacturers that are really affecting our manufacturing growth. And that, of course, manufacturing is a Trump priority as well. So there are things they can do, but I think the president's finding himself in a situation very similar to Ronald Reagan's situation in 1981. Like Carter, Biden really dug a hole in this economy. As the president pointed out, the decline in the standard of living averages out to about $2,900 per American. And so far, the White House says we've only recovered about $1,200 of that in wage growth. Wages are beginning to outpace inflation, but as that differential indicates, there's still a long way to go. And so Reagan's answer in 1981 was stay the course. Let the tax bill finally work its way through the economy, which took some time, but also he stuck with Paul Volcker and the price stability to really wring the inflation out of the system. So if I'm advising President Trump, I'm saying you have this great tax bill you passed. Let's follow up on that. but let's also relax some of these tariffs on our allies to improve manufacturing and to ease the burden on the consumer. And let's stop pestering the Federal Reserve for easy money and allow the price stability to kick in and get inflation back to the target.
Alicia, on the point about tariffs, that is a power to put them on or to take them off that, at least in the president's view, is in his hands. And it is a big tax, I think, that it gets passed through from importers to U.S. consumers. The Tax Foundation, for example, had an analysis this month. It says the Trump tariffs amount to an average tax increase per U.S. household of $1,100 in 2025 and $1,400 in 2026. It goes on to say that this is the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. And so that's a place where the president he put those tariffs on, he could take those tariffs off. And Matt mentions the exceptions now, for example, on bananas. I don't even understand the protectionist point of having that in the first place. There are all sorts of things that are currently being tariffed, like bananas were, that we are not setting up banana growing industries in the United States.
I think that's right. The CBO came out for its monthly budget analysis, just showed that the U.S. raised about $48 billion more via tariffs or custom duties, which is essentially the same thing, during October, November, than the same months last year. And if you extend that over a year, that's about a $300 billion tax increase that is being paid by U.S. consumers or U.S. businesses. Now, a lot of U.S. businesses, small businesses, haven't passed those along. They've been reporting that their margins are being squeezed, but they know that consumers are struggling, or they have competitors, so they haven't wanted to pass on the full increase. But when a small business margins get squeezed, or any business's margins get squeezed, that usually results in less investment or less hiring. So then workers end up having to actually indirectly end up paying some of the costs. So, I mean, the tariff burden really is kind of spread out across the economy. I think President Trump is kind of counting on consumers not to know it, because it's not like a sales tax where, you get your, you go to the store and you see how much the state or the government charge you in sales tax. It's basically the tariff is baked into the price of a lot of goods, or to that extent, actually services, because companies that, provide services also rely on goods. And so I think he's hoping that, the benefits, to the extent that there are benefits, I'm not actually so sure there are any benefits to the tariffs, that it will be, concentrated, in these workers, that the steel companies will hire more workers, and the cost will be diffused, so nobody will care. Your other point about, like, why don't they just, take off the tariffs from most things? Because in reality, the U.S. doesn't produce the vast majority or most things that would be needed to meet demand in the U.S. economy. More than 90% of coffee and bananas are produced abroad for reasons that have to do with climate and such. But, more than 90% of, shoes are also produced abroad. And these, by the way, these tariffs are actually levied on, the baseline tariff. So if you have for Vietnam or China, in China's case, 50% tariff, that's layered on to additional tariffs, which can actually increase the tariff to around 100%. So it's essentially doubling the price. I'll just say it's very easy just to remove these tariffs, and you'd probably see prices on a lot of goods fall. In fact, in recent months, or 2014, you saw prices actually were falling on a lot of goods. And that's partly because of China's economy. And, China's actually been kind of suffering deflation, has been trying to export goods, and has actually at lower prices, which has actually benefited the U.S. consumers until Trump came along and started adding tariffs. And then you start seeing prices on many goods increase again.
But the difficulty, Matt, of taking these tariffs off or some of them off as a political response to this affordability question is it is pretty hard for me to imagine Trump going down that road. I mean, he is mercurial on all sorts of policy issues, but this trade protectionism is something on which he has been consistent for a very long time. So what would be his way out of this cul-de-sac? And let me try one idea out on you. We have this Supreme Court case now pending where the Supreme Court looks like it might strike down these emergency tariffs under a law called IEEPA. And so one thing that is possible, I'm not saying this is necessarily going to happen, is I'm starting to wonder how swiftly and forcefully Trump would respond if the Supreme Court did that. If the Supreme Court said all of these tariffs you've been levying are not within your constitutional power, he could go straight to other laws and start imposing other tariffs by other means on the same sorts of products. Or he could send out some very angry Truth Social posts and then quietly inside the White House, accept this as some economic relief, at least until the 2026 midterms.
The problem is that tariffs have one political constituent in Washington, D.C., and that's the president of the United States. Unlike in the 19th century when you had many mass constituencies for tariffs and manufacturing and the high wall, we really haven't approached that yet in Trump's Washington. The person who is most committed to these tariffs is Donald Trump and, of course, the people who work for him. So he's unlikely to change his belief that tariffs are the ultimate negotiating tool. They're a way to rebalance our relationship with our allies, and they're also a way to leverage America's economic power to achieve other diplomatic or national security aims. But I think you're completely right, Kyle, that if the Supreme Court strikes down tariffs that Trump imposed under his reading of the IEEPA, this statute, then even if he wants to pursue reimposing tariffs, it's going to take longer. Because in the first term, Trump began cementing his reputation as tariff man, but he did so under other statutes. And it took a time for the reports to be compiled and for them to be issued and for deliberations to take place. Trump didn't like that. Trump always wants to act swiftly. That's why he decided to go with this particular statute that's now before the Supreme Court. But if this court moves against him, there will be some breathing room on tariffs, which might actually redound to his political benefit in the midterms.
Alicia, we'll give you the last word, but since you mentioned earlier the labor force and the immigration raids, notable story here, I guess a couple of them paired. So recently, President Trump put a hold on many legal immigration processes, which has resulted in, canceled naturalization ceremonies, for example, for Cubans in South Florida. And notable pushback from a Republican congresswoman down there, Maria Salazar. This is part of her statement. Freezing asylum, green card, and citizenship processes is not the answer. It punishes hardworking, law-abiding immigrants who followed every step of the legal process. That is unfair, un-American, and it goes against everything this country stands for, unquote. And then on Tuesday, the Miami-Dade mayoral race was won by a Democrat, Miami-Dade County Commissioner, former Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins, first Democrat elected to that position in 28 years. So, I mean, this sort of adds to the signals, the warning lights, it seems to me, that are flashing for Republicans in these special elections, off-year elections, the Miami-Dade mayoral race, that the Republican Party has a political problem before we hit these midterms next year.
Right. So I think there are a lot of variables in this particular race, as there usually are, that are unique. In cases there was some outrage over some corruption or alleged corruption with the current Republican mayor. But I think your point about the immigration and the raids and the concerns among the Hispanic community and the Trump crackdown on not just illegal immigration, but also legal immigration by Cubans also did play a role in here because Cubans are a large constituency in Miami. And so I think you've also seen in some of the other, New Jersey and Virginia, the exit polls show that Hispanics turned pretty strongly against Republicans in those states, even compared to if you go back and look at 2020 when Trump didn't do particularly well. And I think this is partly concerns that the Trump is a little out of touch. Isn't his tariffs, by the way, are very unpopular among Hispanics. And then the second being his immigration policies that, I think there was broad support for cracking down on illegal immigration at the border, getting the border under control. But he's definitely gone further, and now he's targeting restaurants, hotels that employ the people. And many of these, to my point, many workers who are even here legally are now afraid that they're going to get caught up in these raids.
Thank you, Alicia and Matt. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.